Well, hello, welcome to my channel. My name is Randy Silva. I've been doing several series on biblical matters, such as the era of the Spirit and the Pharisaical lens and the kingdom and the church. Just finished up the kingdom last week, and we're starting a new series today. This will be part one, called The Nature of Sin. So let's go ahead and get started. That might sound a little daunting at first to think about, the other ones like, hey, the era of the Spirit, that's cool. I like the Spirit, but let's not talk about sin. I should say that this series will not be like a fire and brimstone or repent or perish or you're a really bad person type of lesson. Some of it will be just informational, but more importantly, in most of it, I believe I can clear up some difficult passages which have led to bad theology around how we live our lives as Christians and how we feel about our relationship with God. Things like how, can we lose our salvation? How do we remain saved? Is there some sort of sin that if you commit it, you can never be forgiven? Things like that. There's all kinds of weird theologies on that. So hopefully this series will clear things like that up. And second, I'd like to talk about the nature of sin, as the title implies. In doing so, we can discover the heart or essence of what sin is. There are some lists of sin in the Old Testament and lists of sin in the New Testament, but none of those sins are complete. In fact, some of them in the New Covenant, New Testament just end in "and the like." So there is no definitive list because humans can always find new ways of sinning. So it's important to know what is the heart of sin so that we can know what it is without some sort of a list. So we'll see also that the Bible uses the word sin in many different settings, in many different places, many different contexts. And it really just sort of expects the reader to be able to figure out the context on their own, as it does in passages about just about everything. The Hebrew word for that's translated as sin is kata, and the Greek word is hamartia, and they are both, as I had mentioned or just said, fairly loosely interpreted in different contexts. So this part one is called the categories of sin, and we want to talk about, is there a way to categorize sin, or are there categories of sin? What does sin mean? As I mentioned just briefly ago, the English word sin comes from the Hebrew kata, and then in the Greek New Testament hamartia. And they both are archery terms. Perhaps you've heard that before. They're archery terms meaning to miss the mark. So if you're shooting an arrow at a target and you miss, then you've sinned. But by extension, it means to fail to meet one's goals. So that's what those root words meant in Greek and Hebrew. Now, the Latin word, which comes from the Vulgate, which is the Latin translation of the Bible, the word is peccatum. Yeah, there we go, peccatum. I don't know if that's how you pronounce it or not. I don't know Latin, but it means a moral offense or transgression. Now, sin and peccatum don't sound the same, obviously. So more directly, sin comes from the Latin sans, and then it went to Proto-German sundio, and then the Old English sin, and all three of those, that route of etymology means guilty. So something that you're guilty of or something that makes you feel guilty. I don't think that really helps much, but I wanted to put it in there just so you know. It's an interesting progression if you think about that etymology, that evolution of the word. I'm not very good at archery. I've only done it a few times, and I think anytime there was a target, whether it was one of those bullseyes you're aware of, or maybe like an elk or a deer or something. Sometimes I have those types of targets, not a real one, but like a model of one. I think I've missed every time, even at close range. But I've never, felt like I committed a moral offense. So what is it with this whole missing the mark archery term? So what I've discovered in studying this etymology, this evolution of the word, is that that sin in Christian and Jewish theology developed from this archery term to encompass a broader, more profound meaning than just simply missing the mark. It came to signify willful disobedience, moral failure, or rebellion against God's commands. So I would say basically the translators got it right in terms of interpreting the word sin and what we think the word sin means in English. And we really can't read much into the etymology, this whole archery thing. So, are there categories of sins? And is it even dangerous to think of categories of sins? I would say that in some sense, there is a danger in making categories. If you think about Romans 3, the second part of verse 22 to 23, it says, "There is no difference between Jew and Gentile, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God." Regardless of whether you just told a little lie or if you're a serial killer, I hope you're not, but maybe you are, then you've missed the mark. But again, it's just that archery term doesn't really mean much. In one case, maybe you could say if you just had a little sin, you just barely missed the bullseye, and the other one you missed the target altogether or something. But that metaphor doesn't go very far. What Romans 3 is saying is that no matter what sin or sins you've committed throughout your life, and before you were a Christian or after you're a Christian, or maybe you're not a Christian, but whatever it is, all of those shortcomings, they have made you fall short of what God wanted, because God is perfect. I've found myself, as well as people that I've had relationships with and spoken to and studied the Bible with over the years, that people like to make artificial spectrums of sin. You could think of one that's like on one side you have Mother Teresa, and on the other side you have Hitler. So you've got like really good and really, really bad, and then there's a spectrum in the middle. And I think the main reason why they do this is unless you're Hitler, I don't know who Hitler found that was worse than him, maybe Genghis Khan or somebody. But they're trying to find someone whose sins appear to be worse. And that makes them feel better about themselves. And I don't think that's very useful, very helpful. And so that's definitely not my intention in terms of defining what sin is and categorizing or coming up with categories for sin. So in both the Old Testament and the New Testament, there are verses that seem to create categories or types of sin. And so that's why I wanted to talk about that in this first episode. You can think about, let's say, like the major categories of sin and then maybe some subcategories for some of them. Now, I was raised Catholic up until I was 12, and more than half of those people who call themselves Christian in the world are Catholic, so I think it's useful to look at how they define sin, and I found that there are 3 different classes of sin: original, mortal, and venial. I don't really believe in these. as it were. But again, it's interesting to look at them to cover all of our bases. So, original sin, you might know, stems from Adam and Eve's sin, disobedience in the garden when they ate from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil when they weren't supposed to. And that had ramifications or consequences for all future humans going forward. Catholics believe then that you are actually born with a sin. So you're not starting from a clean slate. You're starting with one sin on there, and that one sin can be forgiven by baptism, whether the baptizee is conscious or not, or conscious of it or not. So that's why they have infant baptism, because you'd want to get that sin off of that person, as quickly as possible, if that's how you believe. Now, a mortal sin is a grave sin, a grave matter done in full knowledge and consent, and it removes your friendship from God, at least temporarily, and it must be confessed. From the website Catholic.org, I found this interesting. It's a little humorous, I think, but it's interesting. It says, any mortal sins that you've confessed or meant to confess but did not do so through no fault of your own are forgiven. You do need to mention them the next time you go to confession. So I don't know if if you either were a Catholic or you're familiar with Catholicism, you're supposed to go to confession, or you sit in this little booth. They actually have one where it's you sit face to face. There's nothing in between you, but most of the time in the movies and what you'll find in churches is the kind where there's this separator where you can't really see through it. So you get in this booth, and nobody can hear you, hopefully, and you confess your sins to the priest. And if it's a mortal sin, you have to do it. Or at least, I guess, have intended to do it. And so this little paragraph I found on their website said that for the future, I would recommend starting all of your confessions with mortal sins first, and then go on to your venial sins. If the priest begins absolution before you are finished confessing your mortal sins, you can politely interrupt him by saying, "I am sorry, Father, but I still have more mortal sins I must confess." So that's the part that I found a little humorous. But it would make sense, right? If you're going to confess your sins, maybe the human nature would be to wait to the end to confess your really bad ones or whatever. But here the Catholic Church is saying you should start with the big ones first and then move on to the little ones. Now, a venial sin is one of those smaller sins. They're less serious. There's a temporal punishment or a time-based punishment for a small amount of time. These can be forgiven by attending Mass and having the Eucharist, the communion, or by some sort of penance, or by purgatory if you happen to die, I guess, before you can do one of these other things, or maybe get the last rites read to you. I think that's one of the things the Catholics also believe in. So there you go. There's, from the Catholic Church, you have original, mortal, and venial. Now, let's go on to some more. Some that come from the Bible itself. So I found, or maybe you've heard of this passage in James chapter 4, it's sins of omission versus sins of commission. So probably most of us are familiar with committing some sort of sin, but then there's this whole class of sins that James talks about, which are good things that you were supposed to have done, but you didn't do them. So it says in James 4:17, anyone who knows the good they ought to do but doesn't do it has sinned. So you can see there's no excuse for failing to do one of God's works that he created you to do. That's it from Ephesians chapter 2, verse 10. That it says that God created us to do good works. So if you don't do one of those good works, then even though you haven't done anything, you done anything like negative, like an actual behavior or something that you did to commit sin, because you failed to do one of these good works, you sinned. So that's kind of a bummer, right? Because now it's like, you were good and you probably haven't really done any big sins or whatever. Well, sorry to rain on your parade, but you've sinned. Okay, so then here's another category, individual versus corporate. Now this might be new or strange to hear if you're not familiar with the Old Testament, the Old Covenant, because it is primarily an Old Covenant thing, although I did find some New Testament, New Covenant references. So an example of this from the Old Testament is Exodus 32. So that is the story of when Moses went up to the mountain and got the Ten Commandments from God. And he was gone for a certain amount of time, and the people got impatient, and they built this golden calf from their jewelry that they all melted down and stuff they'd gotten from the plunder, basically, they'd gotten from Egypt when they left. And they made this calf to worship. And of course, that's not a good thing. That's idolatry. And so God tells Moses about it. He comes down from the mountain. He crashes the Ten Commandments and breaks them. He's very upset. And it says that anyone who had worshipped the calf had their names blotted out of the book. It doesn't really say which book it is, but you can assume that it's like the book of those who are saved. So apparently even in the Old Testament, there was such a book, or there is such a book. And if you were one of those people that had worshipped the calf, then your name's blotted out of it. It doesn't say whether you can get it written back in or what, but and many of those people, there was a plague that came as well right after this. And so many people paid with their lives, and they wouldn't even have had a chance to repent and perhaps get their name put back in the book. So that was a big thing that they did, and you can see it was a corporate sin. It was all the people were doing it, or a lot of the people were doing it, and because of that, a lot of people also were punished for it. Now, another example is Numbers 13 and 14. So this is the story of the 12 spies that were told to go into the Promised Land and view what was there, all the good things, as well as the people who happened to be living there at the time. And if you remember, 10 of those spies gave a bad report. Only 2 of the spies, Joshua and Caleb, gave a good report. And that bad report got to the people more than the words of the 2 that were saying they should go in. And so because of that, all of Israel, all of them, paid for that sin with their lives. They were they weren't all just killed right then, but they had to wander around the desert for 40 years until all of them, including Moses, had died, except for Joshua and Caleb, who were sort of miraculously kept young, because even though they were like 85 years old when they finally did go into the Promised Land with the next generation of Israelites that had been born, or they were under 18 years old at the time of this sin with the spies, Joshua and Caleb were both fighters, and they're all like lots of grit. Let's get in there and get them. So all of Israel paid for it except for Joshua and Caleb. So that's why it's an example of a corporate sin. Now, I did find a few examples of this in the New Testament. So in 1 Corinthians 11, 17 through 34, this is the passage where Paul is talking to the Corinthians about communion, or the Lord's Supper. And in verse 30, it says, "This is why many of you are weak and a number of you have fallen asleep." And it was due to the improper taking of communion. Now, this is an interesting passage to interpret and figure out what it really means. Nevertheless, this is a case where there were a lot of people who weren't taking the communion, and there was this corporate type of punishment. Now, another example I found was in Revelation 3. This is before the crazy, vivid dream it starts with all the interpretations. But in this part is the letter to the churches. And so God writes a letter to all the churches. And in that, you can see God taking sort of a general assessment of the faith and behavior of each of the churches. And there are consequences for some of the negative things the churches had done, and blessings for some of the good things that the churches had done. Okay, so that is individual sins. So I didn't talk about individual sins. Hopefully we know that that's you going out and doing a sin, or as we talked about before, omitting to do something good. And corporate is when the whole body or the whole church or all the Israelites did something, and then they all received some sort of a penalty. Okay, so then you can look at the Old Covenant versus the New Covenant. There's definitely a difference in the way that the Old Covenant talks about sin versus how the New Covenant does. Now remember, the New Covenant and the New Testament and the Old Testament and the Old Covenant are different things. The Old Covenant starts into the Bible, so from the Old Testament, but into Exodus basically is when it starts. When Moses comes down to the mountain with the Ten Commandments, as we were just talking about. So somewhat into the Bible, and then it goes all the way until the resurrection of Jesus. So it goes into the New Testament, into the first 4 books of the New Testament. And then the New Covenant goes from the book of Acts, basically, to Revelation. So I talk about this in part 6 of the Pharisaical Lens series, so you can look at that for more detail. But nevertheless, it can be said that the way the Old Covenant, even in the New Testament Gospels, when Jesus is talking about it, it covers sin differently than the New Testament. For instance, when the woman caught in adultery is brought to Jesus, you can see that the Gospels are sort of a transition from the Old Covenant to the New Covenant, because the Old Covenant said that she needed to be stoned, but Jesus said, "You who are without sin should throw the first stone," and nobody did. In the Old Covenant, one of the things you can see is that there was the sacrificial system. So there was a way, if you broke one of these commands of God in the Old Covenant, not just the 10 commands, but altogether there was 613 commands if you try to count them and enumerate them. There's no list in the Bible, but the Pharisees, the rabbis were, they realized it was Israel's lot in life to follow these laws, and so they went through the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible where the law is given, and enumerated them. Sometimes certain sins were listed a bunch of times, and some of them were combinations, and so they went through as best they could to come up with the individual independent laws, and came up with 613 of them. When you broke one of those, it wasn't like that's it, you're gone. There was this progressively higher levels of sacrifices. So some of the lightest infractions, or the laws that, for instance, the dietary laws, if you ate possibly a calf that was cooked in its mother's milk, that's one of the laws. Or if you ate one of the forbidden animals, like pig, like if you had a bacon, or if you had a bacon cheeseburger, you might have done both of them. The punishment for that sin wasn't that big a deal. It was, you were just unclean until evening. And so for that reason, they didn't have McDonald's or hamburger places back then, but you can kind of imagine that they had a hamburger place right outside the city gates. So just before the end of the day, you could come out, eat your your shrimp or eat your hamburger with cheese and bacon, and then you would be unclean for just a few minutes until the day started. So there was a way kind of to get around these things. Now, some of the one step up from that was you were unclean and you had to wash yourself in a mikveh, which is it's like a baptismal, and it's where baptism comes from. But if you did certain things, maybe even things that weren't, we wouldn't really consider committing a sin, like having a baby, for instance, especially it was having a boy baby. You were unclean for 30 days and then you had to wash yourself. And if it was a girl, you were unclean for 60 days. And that seems somewhat arbitrary, but nevertheless, that's what the law was. But in both those cases, you had to do this washing. And then sometimes the other examples are like if you accidentally touched a dead body, maybe your parent died in the house, and so you had to touch them and bring them out, then you would be unclean and you'd have to wash yourself. And then up from there were different types of sacrifices. Something actually had to be sacrificed. From the simpler or lighter infractions, it would be a certain amount of flour. And then there was birds like pigeons. And then there were lambs and goats. And then there was a bull as like one of the bigger corporate type sins. And so you can see like the animals getting bigger and more of a sacrifice in terms of if you were a farmer and you had to give up a pigeon versus giving up a lamb, that would be a much bigger cost to you if it was a lamb. And then up from there, it was excommunication. So there were some sins, for instance, not showing up to one of the holidays. So there were 5 holidays that you had to show up to Jerusalem. So if you didn't do that and you were a male, then you could be excommunicated, kicked out of the church. And there were also certain skin diseases like leprosy, where you were basically excommunicated. You were taken out of this book. In that case, they actually had a physical book at the temple, and they would say, Joe Smith got leprosy, and he would have to live outside the city, and if he was in the city, he'd have to say he was unclean, and he couldn't go into the temple, and so he was basically excommunicated for the sin, if you will, of catching leprosy or some other sort of skin disease. And then the highest penalty was your life. And that was death by stoning. So people would throw stones at you until you were dead. And that was for things like improper sexual relations, like with someone who wasn't your spouse or with an animal. And also breaking the Sabbath, which is one of the reasons why the Pharisees tried to catch Jesus breaking the Sabbath, because it was one of those, like I guess you'd say, easier sins that we might say is a light sin. You just did a little bit of work on Saturday, but the penalty was death by stoning. Okay, so if you think about other types of sins, that's basically kind of a Old Covenant sins 101. If you go to the New Testament and the New Covenant, the worst types of sins, Jesus, for instance, in Matthew 12, verses 31 through 32, talks about a certain sin that's unforgivable. He says all the other sins are forgivable, but there's this one sin that's unforgivable. From the context, it seems to be something to do with what the Pharisees had just done, which was they said that he had done a miracle, but not by the power of God, but by the power of Beelzebub or Satan. Now, I did speak about this in detail in part 4 of the Era of the Spirit series, which you can review. And I also speak a little bit more about all of these quote worst types of sins in the New Covenant in the upcoming episodes of this series. Now, so there's this forgivable versus unforgivable sin. There's also in 1 John 5, it says a sin that leads to death versus sins that don't lead to death. And you can read this passage. It's in chapter 5, verses 16 through 18. It's really just plain weird. I don't know how else to say it. You think about it. There's a sin that leads to death, and he doesn't say what it is. He just sort of talks over it like, Yeah, there's a sin that leads to death. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the sins that don't lead to death. You can go ahead and pray for a person like that. But implication is you shouldn't pray for somebody who's committed the sin that led to death, because I guess maybe they died because it led to death. Or maybe they're talking about a spiritual death where now they're no longer saved and can't be saved. Anyway, it's an interesting passage. And as I had mentioned in part 4 of the Error of the Spirit, with the forgivable versus unforgivable sin, and here now talking about the sins that lead to death and don't lead to death, you'll find that churches don't talk about them. I don't know if I've ever seen a sermon on 1 John 5. The church just seems to sort of just punt, and most books. I mean, there are some books that cover these things, but most books talk about grace and forgiveness and love and things. You'd think that if this was really, there's just kind of two classes of sins in the New Covenant. One, a bunch of them that are bad, but you can be forgiven, but there's one or two or something that you can never be forgiven for, and you've lost your salvation. You'd want to know what those were, but the church seems to punt. But in this series, I shall not punt. We will talk about them, as I did in part 4 of the Error of the Spirit. There's some other ones that are similar to this. In Hebrews chapter 6, you see there are repentable sins versus sins that are not repentable of. And then in Hebrews 10, you'll see there are sins for which there are no sacrifice of sins left, is what it says, versus, I guess you'd say sins, it doesn't say this, but by implication, there'd be sins for which there is a sacrifice left. So those are all these passages that are kind of scary and enigmatic and tend to be skipped over, but that is what we will talk about in this series. And so you can see, just in summary, that there are some potentially useful ways of categorizing sin. And over the next 2 weeks, the next 2 parts specifically, we're going to talk about these important New Covenant sins that really amount to being saved versus unsaved or unsavable. I'll give you a hint that you'll be relieved that there is a meaning for those sins that lead to death or unforgivability, that it really means something else. And so that should be a good teaser to like and subscribe and be able to come back and watch the next couple of episodes. Thanks again, and have a great night.